Hey guys, Mr. Terry, history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. Today we're looking at a video from the Infographics Show. It's called U.S. Civil War in 2025. It's closer than you think. So when I saw this, I was wondering if it's just a bait topic. Obviously, something like that is going to bring in engagement of people that want to answer this question or give their own hypothetical without ever actually watching what the video is about. But I want to see specifically for my case, what kind of historical context may be brought up in this, if at all. And I guess if not, what can we insert with a hypothetical of this situation? All right, this original video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you're supporting them. By the way, this week we released 2 original videos. We got our newest alternate history video from the series that we have now gone 2 episodes into. That one being, what if Trotsky took over the Soviet Union after Lenin's death instead of Stalin? Then a couple of days ago, released a video on Catherine the Great. That one's in my format, which is going to be a little bit more lighthearted, funny, but still have a lot of information and something to think about. Check those out. I think you'll like them. All right, let's get started with this one. All right, now I know a lot of you are probably already putting comments down, like I said before, inserting your own hypotheticals, probably based on some extreme recency bias of some form or the other. Let's see what they got there, if they're actually going to maybe go deeper into some deeper roots. Because civil wars often have that.
What if the biggest threat to the U.S. isn't invasion, but imitation? Not a war started by tanks or missiles, but by a video and a lie. A deepfake so convincing it didn't just mislead, it fractured a country. This isn't a war from the history books. It's faster, digital, unpredictable, and just as bloody. This is what a U.S. civil...
That's an interesting thing to consider if you think about it. You know what immediately came to my mind was like War of the Worlds, you know, H.G. Wells with the fake radio broadcasts that may or may not have actually put people in a frenzy or not, made for the good story and everything. But it is an interesting thing about how bad as a society we are at percepting content as far as it being truthful, misrepresenting things. Could that be something that could trigger something big? Are we so ingrained into media, and does it have a much bigger impact on us than we have on actually interpreting and analyzing its content for accuracy? You know, which wins out there, I guess. Okay, all right, this is interesting, and we're only 20 seconds in.
War would look like in 2025.
Okay.
The video hit the Eastern Seaboard at 6:03 a.m. on a Wednesday, leaked from an encrypted European message board. It made its way onto several American political forums. Then it exploded.
You know, I thought, it's the Balkans again. It's the Balkans. Once again, Bismarck is still right.
It made its way onto several American political forums. Then it exploded. X, YouTube, Telegram. Within a few minutes, millions had seen
channel.
The setting was unmistakable. The Supreme Court bench, framed by American flags and cold marble columns. At the center sat the Chief Justice, flanked by silent justices, reading aloud what appeared to be a historic ruling. In a calm, authoritative tone, he declared emergency federal control over all state elections, a sweeping power grab that sent shockwaves through the political landscape. The video was just under 2 minutes long. It looked real, it sounded real, and perhaps most dangerously of all, it felt real. Because for many Americans, the content of that video didn't seem far-fetched. It felt inevitable. The court had...
I mean, how quick do you think something has to be, like, shown like that would really get a significant amount of people to go full, I guess, I don't know, revolution to a depth where it's irreversible? That's where I will have, I'm sure, my doubts about anything when it comes to this sort of media. And again, it depends on that. Like, okay, federal control or whatever it says of elections, is that something that would be like the tipping point? And I guess I should ask you guys this, depending on what it is they come out with here, is there some kind of decision that could be made by lawmakers, president, Supreme Court or something that could have that type of instantaneous reaction that would be so divisive and bring people to such a tipping point that a full-on irreversible, basically civil war could go on? Is it that one that he was saying about, you know, federal oversight of like elections or federal takeover of elections? Consolidation of power, I guess.
in fact, heard a major case just 2 weeks earlier, centered around emergency federal powers concerning government layoffs and state election protocols. The case had been fast-tracked following a high-profile standoff between the Department of Justice and the state of California. Rumors had swirled for days that a ruling was imminent.
California would be
When the video
involved.
dropped, it didn't seem out of place.
I know a lot of people believe
the
that.
timeline matched. The docket number looked authentic. Even seasoned members of the press pool believed that this might be an early unofficial leak. By 6:07, it had been reposted over 80,000 times. At 6:11, hashtag Article 4 trended across every major social media platform. By 6:15, armed groups in Idaho.
But is it okay? Okay, 6:15. Okay, we're already okay. But isn't this one of those things that could easily just somebody comes out from the state or something? It's like, no, that actually is not the case, right? Especially if it's a fake decision. Let me go back a little bit.
It had been reposted over 80,000 times. At 6:11, hashtag Article 4 trended across every major social media platform. By 6:15, armed groups in Idaho, Georgia, and northern Michigan were already mobilizing.
Okay, I totally get Idaho. Okay, somebody that lives in the western half of the United States. That's happened. Idaho is like the Texas of the West, essentially. And Georgia, okay, whatever. North Michigan? I need some context, I guess, there. You never hear about the little tip of Michigan that's sitting on top of Wisconsin.
By 6:15, armed groups in Idaho, Georgia, and northern Michigan were already mobilizing. Online forums lit up with claims that this was a second Patriot Act, where others celebrated it as a long-awaited end to state nullification. Across the country, people already full of distrust and resentment became defensive, suspicious, and braced for impact. Then,
now, the whole, like, would there be a division and a mix of people being both supportive and not supportive of, like, that supposed Supreme Court division? Yeah, I do think that is the case. All right. Time and time again, we've seen in history that authoritarian rule can come about with support, especially if you find that you are on the side of those that would gain power, if you fall into line with that. And obviously there's going to be people that aren't with that. And then there are people, though, that are, of course, going to be that other group that may, in fact, despite of who controls the Supreme Court, they'll be totally against it, right? Regardless of like political affiliation of those that are making these decisions. But I think that group is smaller than people might think. You know what I mean?
Came the second video. At 7:08 a.m., a new broadcast appeared on Signal, then Telegram, then Truth Social. The governor of California appeared on screen, seated behind his desk at the state capitol. He looked composed, deliberate, and resolute. In a calm but defiant tone, he announced that California did not recognize the Supreme Court's ruling. It was, he said, a violation of the constitutional rights of the people.
That becomes hard because that's what's supposed to be the Supreme Court's job, is to interpret the Constitution. So if that is no longer the case, or people reject that, and that whole branch of government becomes invalid, I guess, in the eyes of people. I was also wondering, this video came out, I think, 6 days before I watched this. Do you think this is also trying to build upon the big debate going on about gerrymandering across the country? You get kind of vibes of that, especially, you're bringing in California. Big one happening right now they're talking about is in Texas.
State would be forming a coalition for constitutional restoration, inviting other states to join in resisting federal overreach. He ended with a chilling declaration: any federal incursion without legislative approval would be treated as unlawful. Within 30 minutes, the video had racked up more than 20 million views, but there was one problem. Both videos were fake. The source was traced to a previously unknown group operating on the darknet and secure foreign servers. They were believed to be a hybrid of rogue domestic actors and foreign contractors with access to next-generation AI video generation tools. But this wasn't the usual AI slop. There were no lip-sync glitches, no uncanny valley stares, no telltale digital seams. This was synthetic footage indistinguishable from reality, built with access to proprietary modeling datasets and advanced voice cloning tools far beyond consumer-grade capabilities.
Isn't this just still one of those things, though, where whoever that's being faked can just come back and very easily and be like, no, that's not true? Whether it's the Supreme Court, the president, the governor of California. Like, is it really like irreversible to that point?
Lip movement synced with breath patterns. Micro expressions matched each speaker's known tics. Background audio recreated courtroom acoustics.
I think this could be an a big-time overreaction.
One metadata analyst would later admit it looked more authentic than the real thing. It took nearly 2 hours before the Supreme Court issued a formal statement denying the video's authenticity. By then, it was too late. Dozens of local officials had already issued statements. Militias had formed roadblocks outside of state houses. Some police departments announced that they would not comply with the DOJ. Others pledged allegiance to the emergency order. The White House's first response was...
That's what I was saying. Like, some people would be, fall in line with those fake orders, and then some would, but it being like irreversible, I'm still having a problem with this, because I do also believe that a lot of people get sick, and there is a cynicism that people have too also about media, and maybe it's bigger than we think. And if you're terminally online person, you might react really hard, but like everyday people that are just living their lives, you know what I mean, that are often not as fixated on media are going to be impacted like this. I feel like that group is bigger than people think as well.
A single-line press release. No such ruling has been issued by the Supreme Court. We are investigating the source of the unauthorized video.
Is it over right now?
In the months leading up to the war, the State Department had been issuing quiet warnings. AI-generated videos impersonating the Secretary of State were already targeting foreign officials. At the time, it seemed novel, even amusing. But this wasn't amusing. This was weaponized unreality. For 48 hours, the United States no longer had a single reality. Domestic life itself had become a digital illusion.
That makes sense. I mean, that part makes sense. Where it's like, okay, if you don't know if that original thing is real or not, then you easily could say the same thing about the rebuttal. Then it's like, who do I trust in that situation? And that is just, I guess you would think people just go into their own predispositions, their own previously held biases or whatever. And when that many people actually take like direct action based off of that.
Within minutes of the fake Supreme Court ruling's release, confusion gripped every level of government. Local law enforcement flooded federal channels with questions. Was this legitimate? Did it require immediate enforcement? Could they act on a ruling that hadn't been formally published? But there was no clear answer. The military, too, was split. Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State delayed all operations, pending confirmation from higher command. Meanwhile, Fort Hood in Texas received unofficial orders from the Pentagon to prepare for domestic deployment. But when a division commander refused to act without clarification from civilian leadership, and civilian leadership had not agreed on what was real, operational paralysis set in. The National Guard...
So, one thing to add, and then this is not necessarily as much American or context from American history, but the idea of split loyalties among militaries has been a major feature of many civil problems and civil wars, rise of dictators all throughout history, all over the planet. That is something that has big. So if you're wondering, like in the United States, well, could that happen or not? Well, globally, both recently and going all the way back to ancient history, this has been a thing. And the United States hasn't had that nearly as much. You've probably heard maybe of a lot of dictators in history that did rise through the military power. We haven't had that really in the United States, of just like completely using the military to go against the full will of the government to the extent where you have massive regime changes with that. Now, the U.S. is still a young country, but younger countries than the U.S. have had those same issues.
Controlled by state governors, fractured along political lines.
Okay, so we got National
In red
Guards.
states, some units swore to uphold the federal directive. In blue states, others denounced it as a constitutional fraud. By mid-morning, governors across the country began convening emergency sessions. Each meeting took on a life of its own. Colorado's governor called for calm and demanded an investigation. Florida's governor praised the court's courage to act in a time of national crisis.
Do you think these are hypotheticals, or do you really think they're like, all right, this is, Governor Newsom, DeSantis, like you think that's what they're trying to do?
There was no coordinated response, only a widening divide. The White House, already reeling from its early morning statement, scrambled to seize back control of the narrative. At 11 a.m., the press secretary stepped behind a visibly unsteady podium and addressed the nation. The Chief Justice wasn't in the country.
All right. Is that supposed to be Bill Clinton? I don't know why I just immediately looked at that and thought that.
Unsteady podium and addressed the nation. The Chief Justice wasn't in the country. The ruling was
on
clearly
vacation.
fake. There had been no federal seizure of state authority. But it was too late. The internet had already moved on. Tech platforms unprepared for the speed and scale of the deepfake spread struggled to respond. YouTube removed the video only after 2 million views.
That'll just feed the conspiracists more, right? But there's also so many conspiracists and terminally on people that are also pure talk and won't actually get outside and like do the revolutionary thing. But we also know that there are, and some of them are incredibly scary.
Flagged it as potentially manipulated, but left it up. Telegram ignored it. Deepfake detection systems were slow to react. By the time independent analysis confirmed the footage was fake, the clips had already cemented themselves as gospel inside digital echo chambers.
You think
conspiracy groups jumped on it. Message boards and podcasts claimed that it was part of the long-term plan. Some claimed the deepfake was real and the denials were part of the deception. Others believed the video was part of a false flag operation, a plot staged by the feds to provoke civil unrest and justify a power grab. For believers on either side, the only proof required was that their enemies were panicking.
I feel like this has already happened, and we've seen so many conspiracies about stuff like that. I mean, I had heard some too that martial law was declared. I remember a student came up to me. It was like during class or like while the students were working. A student came up and was like, "Mr. Terry, I just saw that like the martial law has been declared on like with our country." I'm like, what are you talking about? And of course, go to the computer, and it was referred to something that really wasn't that. You know what I mean?
By nightfall, the first blood was drawn.
Oh, no.
In rural Oregon, a standoff between a county sheriff's department and a National Guard convoy erupted after the sheriff refused to allow federal agents to access a communications tower. When negotiations broke down, gunfire rang out. 2 National Guardsmen and 1 deputy were injured before the convoy withdrew. That night, the sheriff live-streamed a defiant statement saying a line in the sand had been drawn. The video reached 5 million views in 6 hours, and the line, already blurred, was gone.
Now, that is one thing we've seen, anything with police action. I mean, you've seen so many stories in the last just few years. If it's like a police brutality, police response to something, and, and someone dies, how that can trigger things like protests, even riots that can lead to violence and destruction. Like, we do know that can happen. And that's where I'm wondering if that is the more likely outcome of this rather than full out U.S. Civil War in the sense that, like, we think about the American Civil War, the 1860s, that like institutionalized, I guess.
Week 1. By the end of the first week, the United States had split, both formally and functionally. The Department of Justice responded with force, at least on paper. It issued a sweeping set of arrest warrants targeting state officials accused of, quote, subverting federal authority and promoting insurrection. The list was like a who's who of political defiance. Secretaries of state from California, Oregon, and New York, governors, and even multiple state Supreme Court justices. But the orders were ignored, or worse, laughed off. No U.S. Marshals attempted enforcement. There were no doors kicked in or arrests because, in many states, there was no one left willing to carry them out.
Do you think we have enough institutional independence for stuff like that to happen on that scale? Like, just the U.S. Marshals, to a large enough extent, aren't going to actually, carry out their orders, or again, the military, National Guard, police. You think we have that in us?
Inside the military, the chain of command fractured.
What would that require?
Chiefs issued guidance urging constitutional clarity, but lower-level commanders weren't waiting for instructions. Some activated regional logistics hubs to, quote, ensure public order. Others refused federal direction altogether. One general in Georgia began using a private encrypted messaging app to coordinate directly with sympathetic governors, bypassing the Pentagon entirely. The DoD, paralyzed by political crossfire, stopped releasing public statements. The courts fared no better. Federal judges attempted to hold emergency hearings via Zoom, only to be drowned out by denial of service attacks and jurisdictional disputes.
That's not going to be very secure.
In multiple states, federal court rulings were simply not recognized by local authorities. State courts declared themselves the only legitimate arbiters of justice within their borders. Legal scholars called it a constitutional crisis, but in the streets, it felt different. California joined forces with Washington and Illinois to form the Coalition for Constitutional Restoration. Florida made it illegal to disobey federal orders. Texas revived old defense laws to arm civilian militias.
Again, how much of this, when you're thinking about the political makeup of these states, will rely upon political alliances of whoever is in charge, whether it's the executive branch, I'm talking federally, or the Supreme Court? Like, could this just as well be the opposite, right? Where federal orders coming down might actually be supported by Washington, California, and it's Florida and Texas, that do the opposite of this scenario. I think, and I don't know if you'd call us in a cynical way, that's just as likely.
State to state, the laws no longer matched. Your rights depended on where you lived. Major corporations scrambled to adapt to the unfolding situation. Apple and Meta halted operations in Flashpoint regions, citing threats to staff and infrastructure. Amazon moved its warehouses to states aligned with federal authority.
Okay, this is where I'm not so sure. I mean, the corporations, they are so involved in all of this stuff too. I feel like these large ones are going to be the last ones to go down. They're the ones that have the power, the money, the influence over government to be able to maintain itself, right? It's like, is this going to be the destruction of like the functionality of our own capitalism? I don't think so.
Media split overnight. Some networks doubled down on partisan narratives, while others went dark entirely.
Whatever
By
gets
the end of the
views.
week, the question wasn't if the country was coming apart, it was how far the cracks would go. As America splintered, the information domain became a no man's land of competing realities.
Rage bait.
Dozens of AI-generated news broadcasts flooded streaming platforms, each claiming to be from credible outlets. One feed showed a uniformed general announcing full military control of the West Coast. Another claimed federal troops had taken over state houses in Tallahassee and Albany. None of it was real, but each video bore network-style lower thirds, familiar faces, even stolen logos. The American public had no way to tell what was real. In Ohio, residents received an emergency shelter-in-place alert at 3:24 a.m. on...
Wait, did he say Ohio? Ohio's the first?
Ohio residents received logos. The American public had no way to tell what was real. In Ohio, residents received an emergency shelter-in-place alert at 3:24 a.m. on
Skibbity,
Thursday.
Ohio.
Emergency federal order. Shelter in place. Do not approach military vehicles. State control deemed compromised. It was a hoax, of course. The system had been hacked.
It was the Russians. It was Putin the whole time. I mean, that's the stuff that you probably could think, right? Would it be a foreign state adversary to be the one injecting this stuff to, divide up the country?
Experts later traced it to an advanced threat group operating out of Russia, but the damage was done. Terrified citizens barricaded themselves in basements while armed militias flooded the roads. The state government was forced to shut down the entire alert system for 72 hours to prevent further manipulation. On social media, chaos reigned. Platforms tried to keep up, but the damage was already done. Dozens of blue-check influencers, pundits, and streamers capitalized on the confusion, proclaiming loyalty to one faction or another. Their follower counts exploded. So did their influence.
This is where it's like, to keep that kind of media clout, people are going to require you to pick a side, right? You've got to do it. Do you condemn this or that? We need you to do it. I need you to validate me.
In a world where trust in institutions was gone, verified voices became digital warlords, wielding audience loyalty like a private army. Encrypted channels on platforms like Signal, Telegram, and Matrix became central nervous systems of the resistance and the rebellion. Armed groups coordinated supply drops, movements, even drone strikes via secure group chats. Private citizens shared...
See, this is where Amazon and the big companies are going to actually make this so good for themselves. It's going to be the opposite of what they're saying. How was it Apple or Amazon or whatever are just going to like shut down because of a lack of infrastructure? Like, they are the infrastructure. You kidding me? They're going to make a fortune off of this stuff. Then Amazon wouldn't love to make a whole bunch of money dropping supplies and information using their own infrastructure. I mean, look at what they have. They are now delivering. Everything they deliver is with their own vehicles and stuff. Do you guys remember? It wasn't that long ago, just a few years ago, that they were exclusively working with the post office, where they were trying to build up these massive fleets for vans and stuff like that, and their own drivers to be able to deliver stuff. And then the whole thing about them still continuing to invest in like drones to be able to deliver packages. You know what I mean? Right. Someone's got to profit from this.
Evacuation maps, blackout alerts,
I guess
and
all,
emergency first aid PDFs.
props to
State
them, right?
actors, foreign and domestic, listened in, spread disinformation, or impersonated key figures. By the end of the first week, one thing was sure. No one was sure who was actually in charge anymore. But problematically, everyone believed someone was. Week 2. By the end of the second week, the
Deep
old
states.
American map was obsolete. There were no official borders, no declarations of independence, no flags raised over state capitals. Not yet. But on the ground, the country now operated in discrete zones, some aligned, some opposed, some simply trying to survive. On the West Coast, a new allegiance emerged.
From this point on in the video, I'm going to grant all of the presumptions and set that they have, just so I don't have to keep repeating the same things and like disregarding everything from whatever starting point I think this became like illogical or whatever, and I'll just grant this. But yeah, I mean, we do know that we have microcultures across our country. We saw that back with the Civil War broke out. You know, we had almost like two differently operating regions of our country with different cultures, different economic structures, starting from, you know, when Europeans started colonizing, you know, what's going to eventually be the United States, all the way to the 1860s, when how different our country was operating was just made abundantly clear. But yeah, you probably have those, you know, little factions.
Opposed, some simply trying to survive. On the West Coast, a new allegiance emerged. The politically aligned states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii announced the formation of the Pacific Coalition. In a joint broadcast, their governors declared that they would no longer comply with federal directives unless ratified by their respective legislatures.
I mean, you could have a functional, a pretty decently functioning country if just the West Coast, you know, broke off. I mean, you hear constantly about the economic wealth that is in, you know, a place like California and all the way up through the Western coast. You could have that. It would change a lot of things when it comes to like importing the stuff that you don't have, you know, if there was like a clean break, especially maybe if there was one that was more amicable, you know, could California still get certain types of oil, even though there's oil production that they have, or, you know what I mean? The different things that you need from different parts of the country.
What they called the principle of coordinated sovereignty and unveiled a regional security pact to defend their shared interests. West Coast National Guard units were consolidated under regional command. Military bases, ports, and infrastructure were placed under local control. San Francisco became the coalition's nerve center, a digital capital for what some now called Pacifica. In the Southeast and Midwest, a counterweight.
Do you think it would be San Francisco? I feel like so much of their power has dwindled in, you know, the last while. You could say maybe it's like, you know, LA County, but I guess logistically that's a problem being so far south in this new coalition of Western states. I guess if that was like, let's say there was a unification of those states into a new country, what do you think the capital would be? Would it be like an LA, or they try to like literally relocate, you know, further north or more central? I mean, right in the middle of that coalition is like the northern part of Northern California, where there aren't a lot of big cities.
The Constitutional Alliance, a bloc spearheaded by Texas and Florida, joined by parts of Tennessee, Oklahoma, Indiana, and the Dakotas. These states pledged to uphold constitutional continuity through federal unity and declared support for DOJ authority in the original emergency ruling.
Do you guys think that would be a natural coalition, those states?
Even as its origin remained disputed, Texas reactivated its state guard and began absorbing sympathetic militia groups into formalized command structures.
Well, we know Texas
Florida declared control over its ports and coastline in defense of national cohesion. But this wasn't a clean north-south divide. The war wasn't between regions. It was between realities. Urban centers became fortress states. Cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, and St. Louis declared temporary autonomy from their state governments. They formed local councils and citizen militias.
Well, for so many of the state governments do operate out of there. Okay, we know sometimes the capitals of states aren't necessarily their biggest state, but I mean, when it still comes to the resources and where the people are and stuff, it seems like the power would easily shift to population centers. You know, for California, it's not just going to be like Sacramento, you know what I mean? Becoming now all of a sudden the power.
To control their own police, utilities, and emergency protocols. They weren't blue cities and red states. They were armed micro-nations navigating between collapsing jurisdictions. Some aligned with the Pacific Coalition, others playing both sides, many simply trying to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, the suburbs burned purple. These purple zones became the bloodiest, most unstable regions. In places like central Pennsylvania, northern Virginia, and the outskirts of Dallas, neighborhoods were split by ideology, ethnicity, and trust. PTA groups turned into militia cells. Neighborhood watch groups blockaded.
Yeah, the PTA. You know, the stay-at-home mom in your neighborhood that helps organize, you know, the bake sales and stuff like that. She is like, you know, screaming her manifesto from the steps of the elementary school.
And trust. PTA groups turned into militia cells. Neighborhood watch groups blockaded intersections. Schools and hospitals flew neutral flags, if they remained open at all. In the chaos, neutral zones emerged. Denver declared itself a diplomatic city-state, refusing to take sides and inviting mediation from international observers.
Is that the case? Do you think that would happen with Denver? I don't know. As politically motivated as any other major city.
Chicago declared a pause in political alignment and negotiated corridor status for humanitarian convoys. In D.C., foreign embassies closed their gates, fortified their compounds, and waited. Corporations didn't.
Wait, why are we spelling embassy
Foreign
this
embassies
way?
closed their gates, fortified their compounds, and waited. Corporations didn't pick sides, they picked servers. Google moved its executive command center to a hardened facility outside Salt Lake City, just east of a booming Silicon Slopes.
Okay. I mean, Salt Lake is, I mean, that kind of makes sense because it is surrounded by hours and hours of nothing outside of it. I mean, it takes like 6-hour drive to get to Boise, and it's like 8 to Denver. And again, like 6 to Vegas. You know, it is kind of a, I guess in the middle, I guess you could kind of fall back into that area. But when I had originally was pausing to talk was, yeah, these companies are always going, you know, you would think would be trying to, you know, stay ahead of that. They're going to, you know, keep doing whatever they can to function and, God forbid, you know, profit from it.
Amazon split its logistics between Utah and Toronto. A new class of digitally sovereign corporate zones sprang up. Cloud-based strongholds where businesses could continue under artificial governance frameworks enforced by smart contracts and air-gapped data centers.
If you didn't know, the kind of Salt Lake metro area and further south, kind of the northern half of Utah, actually is a very growing tech hub. There's a lot of tech companies, big companies that are operating there as well. It's been pretty business friendly with that. Even like the NSA, has incredible amount of their servers and digital storage for the country in northern Utah as well. So if we thought that was random, there actually is a big tech infrastructure in Utah.
Under artificial governance frameworks enforced by smart contracts and air-gapped data centers. Microsoft's Azure region outside of Cheyenne became a corporate government hybrid with its own militia protection.
Cheyenne, a little
the union
tech
hadn't
hub too?
declared dissolution, it had simply stopped functioning. Warfare in this new climate of instability proved anything but conventional. In Texas, a National Guard convoy was struck by a swarm of hobbyist drones retrofitted with commercial explosives.
Hey, we've seen this happen. You see that attack, you know, a couple months ago, whatever, with Ukraine into Russia, where they were using, you know, little pretty cheap drones that were able to hit like military installations. Don't laugh at that part.
In Portland, blackouts began with no warning.
Yeah,
Two
Portland's going
substations had
down.
been hacked using default
Portland will go into
manufacturer
pure
passwords.
chaos.
In Atlanta, a municipal dam was opened in the middle of the night, flooding a loyalist neighborhood.
Oh no.
No one ever claimed responsibility. No one needed to. In 2025, attribution was as good as fiction. Rural militias used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, pipeline
still the
sabotage, highway
Russians
raids.
this whole time?
In cities, loyalist forces deployed quadcopters with thermal imaging and facial recognition to hunt known dissidents in alleyways.
Another reason why tech companies would maybe not be all that upset that this is going on. They're super useful right now.
Armed engagements were fast, fluid, and often one-sided. Most casualties didn't know they were in a war zone until it was too late. 3D printed guns, grenade launchers, and custom rifle attachments
Terrorism.
flooded the underground.
Incredible
Hackers
amount of
released
terrorism.
CAD files for printable landmines and anti-drone nets. Surveillance gear was home-brewed. A decent engineering student could
Wait, is that supposed to be Trump in his mech suit?
and anti-drone nets. Surveillance gear was home-brewed. A decent engineering student could build a kill box for under $500. On the propaganda front, AI became a fully operational combatant. Thousands of horrifying variations of the same video, edited for different dialects,
Skynet
regions, and
becomes
psychological
self-aware.
profiles, circulated by the hour. In one version, the federal military was seen liberating a town from armed insurgents. In another, they were massacring civilians.
You know, a term you would start hearing a lot by these different groups is liberation. People love to say that. We're liberating this place. We're liberating these places. Something that pretty much anybody can claim or attempt to.
Both were fakes, but were believed. Language was a weapon. Visuals were a payload. Across the country, young digital insurgents armed with tools like Stable Diffusion and GPT-based editors churned out revolutionary manifestos and cinematic call-to-arms videos. It felt more real than anything broadcast on the evening news. This was no longer a war
People
that
don't
could
watch
be
that
won
anymore.
with tanks or treaties.
boomers.
It was about holding attention. And in a fractured
And they're too
nation
old
where
for all this.
reality had shattered into 1,000 feeds, attention was the most strategic resource of all. In this terrifying new landscape, the military broke first, the government fractured next, then society itself followed.
So institutional collapse has pretty much would have to happen for something like this. The issue with, with that is United States institutions, for as much as people, I think, may not think so, are actually quite strong and quite stable, especially when you compare it to the history of other countries.
Families split, politically and geographically. A father in Tennessee joined a local Constitutional Alliance militia, while his daughter, studying in Berkeley, volunteered for the Pacific Coalition
Sure.
Civilian Defense
Families
Corps.
will be split
They
apart,
stopped
no doubt.
speaking after a phone call turned into a shouting match over whether the Supreme Court ruling had ever happened. One believed it was fake. The other
I mean, not unlike the Thanksgiving conversations you've all either participated in or overheard, right?
shouting match over whether the Supreme Court ruling had ever happened. One believed it was fake. The other believed the
think people
denial
would
was
forget
the
about
real
it.
deception. Some tried to
original
remain
thing.
neutral, packing up, moving to the so-called gray zones in the Mountain West or Upper Midwest.
What is
But
that hat?
neutrality had a short shelf life. In Utah, a family fleeing California was turned away at a gas station by an armed volunteer checkpoint. The driver had an old Restore Democracy bumper sticker, and that was enough. Grocery stores were
gosh.
emptied and water became currency. Blackouts
true.
were common.
Yeah.
Internet outages were weaponized. In some towns, people bartered with canned food and antibiotics.
I mean, that's what we have seen when economic collapse happens. We go back to the barter systems of our ancestors. A recent example, even up to a couple years ago, the hyperinflation that took place in Argentina, where people were now just literally trading commodities on WhatsApp. Right? Like, okay, we need some food or something. We have some, still in good condition kids' clothes that my kids have grown out of. Let's make a trade, right? You heard of that stuff all the time. We always will, devolve back to that once money collapses, I guess. Banking institutions, if that's going to fall with it.
In others, armed guards escorted water trucks between neighborhoods. Local radio returned as the primary news source in many places, if you could find batteries. Underlying it all was a creeping sense of tribalism. It was a divide
sure.
not only between left and right, but between those who still believed in the idea of a United States and those who no longer thought it ever truly existed. While Americans argued over what was real, the rest of the world didn't wait.
Okay, so what would happen from this is development of feudalism. Feudalism, if you don't want to talk about feudalism, look into it. But this is what happens when empires or states collapse naturally, is feudalism. Essentially a coalescing of societies into smaller groups led by people that can be powerful in protecting you and your own needs locally, rather than a larger, more foreign entity. We see this happen all the time. Look what happened to Europe, when the Roman Empire collapsed.
Within days of the initial fracture, eager Chinese officials extended an offer of technical and humanitarian assistance to the Pacific Coalition. Officially, it was to help restore disrupted shipping lanes and maintain digital infrastructure.
This stuff will always come at a cost, right? You have other countries that are going to want foreign aid, but of course they're going to want something in return. United States, has done this in history with civil conflicts and kind of supplying or trying to gain allies with a side, kind of a you scratch your back, I'll scratch my back kind of thing. A lot of countries have engaged in this type of thing before historically.
Unofficially, Chinese telecom technicians and logistics personnel began acting on contingency plans and operating out of Oakland and Tacoma. Satellite internet nodes and
Coast, a little
unmanned
closer.
surveillance balloons were offered at no cost. The Pacific governors called it a temporary partnership. Washington called it treason. Russia moved faster.
Sure.
Chaos was the bottom line. Payback for
Ukraine?
years of arms shipments to Ukrainian freedom fighters. Intelligence services began funneling cryptocurrency and weapons to rural insurgent networks in Texas, Appalachia, and the Rust Belt.
Do you believe that it'd be Russia and China that exploit or at least take advantage of the situation more than any other country? I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? All right, the Texas Appalachia Rust Belt for sure.
Currency and weapons to rural insurgent networks in
AKs
Texas,
in the US.
Appalachia, and the Rust Belt. Russian contractors, many tied to former Wagner elements, appeared in social media footage training local militias under the banner of defensive sovereignty. Russian
Mercenaries.
media outlets branded
Foreign
them as
mercenaries show up.
democracy's heroes, resisting an illegitimate digital coup. And as if nobody saw it coming, the United Nations froze. A Security Council resolution to call for mediation failed after both China and Russia issued vetoes.
Shoot, no. I mean, the U.S., Russia, and China, they're such big entities in the UN. It's like, would the UN be able to even do anything?
Multiple members proposed recognizing different successor factions. The
UN has
Pacific Coalition,
very little
the
enforcing
Constitutional Alliance, even
power.
Denver's self-declared Federal Continuity Council. No consensus formed. Some embassies in Washington evacuated entirely, others fortified and waited. And then came the mercenaries. Foreign nationals posing as private security consultants, former NATO soldiers, others from Brazil, Serbia, Turkey, and South Africa.
See, I don't even know if it would be necessarily foreign mercenaries. There's plenty of the people in the United States that absolutely would become mercenaries. We know how armed our population is. There are definitely going to be people that, I don't know, want to live out, I guess, a mercenary fantasy of some kind, simply based on who will give them the better deal out of the different sides, void of any like ideological leanings. But okay, yeah, foreign mercenary, that's fine too.
Former NATO soldiers, others from Brazil, Serbia, Turkey, and South Africa, offered their services to state legislatures. One convoy of former French foreign legionnaires was spotted operating in eastern Colorado, guarding a lithium extraction facility. Global markets unraveled. With the U.S. fractured, the dollar's reserve status fell under scrutiny. Oil contracts began shifting toward the yuan. Stock exchanges in London and Tokyo shed billions in a matter of days. Multinational firms abandoned U.S. operations or moved them offshore.
This could easily trigger a global economic recession, no doubt.
Of days, multinational firms abandoned U.S. operations or moved them offshore.
I mean, we see what happened when like Greece's economy was failing, or Icelandic banks have problems. Like it has massive ripple effects. Imagine what the United States doing that. Whew.
Multinational firms abandoned U.S. operations or moved them offshore. American credibility, military, economic, and diplomatic, collapsed faster than any warhead could have managed. 18 months later, a year and a half after the deepfake ruling that never was, the United States was shattered, unwilling to be pieced back together. Rigid territorial lines had formed. Redrawn zones hardened where supply lines, population loyalty, and armed control overlapped. Some states were split down the middle, others divided into city-states, tribal regions, or corporate protectorates. Movement between territories required passes, bribes, or heavy escort. Maps were updated weekly. None stayed accurate for long. Trade routes became...
All of that has been common in civil conflict too. Like, no, this all has an incredible amount of precedent around the world.
Escort. Maps were updated weekly. None stayed accurate for long. Trade routes became arteries of survival. Control of the highways, rail hubs, and river access determined who had power and who got food, fuel, and medicine. The economy didn't crash. It morphed into something strange. In neutral zones, people traded food, fuel, medicine, and even hard drives. Crypto became the main currency in city enclaves.
Does it? Because my initial thought about whatever currency is going to be there is, maybe more commodity based. And that could, again, be something that happens, further down the line as a last resort to any type of currency being gone. So would crypto benefit from this? Do we go back to a gold standard? Is that just irreversible by now? So I guess before, we reverse completely to just trading items for items.
Places printed their own money. A can of food might be worth 2 hours of power or a handful of bullets. Tech hubs like Silicon Valley and Austin became walled-off mini-nations run by CEOs instead of politicians. If you followed their rules, you got security and the internet. If not, you were out. A few cities, like Denver and Chicago, acted as independent city-states, trying to mediate between the warring sides. But no one spoke for the whole country anymore. Everyone was tired. The war, born from a lie, now ran on fear. The toll was massive. 5 million displaced to nearly 300,000 dead. Not from battles, but from 5 million displaced to nearly 300,000 dead. Not from battles, but from chaos. The old America still lived in memories. But peace, that was something ordinary people stopped believing in. Okay, but could something like this actually happen? Check out, could the United States have another civil war?
Isn't that what
to
this
see if
is?
it's even on the table, or click on this video instead.
All right, final thoughts. All right, I don't want to rehash all the things I agreed and disagreed with. I mean, the premise, I guess, about like a constitutional crisis of a takeover of, I guess, state elections and elections in general being just taken over, I guess, by the executive branch, whatever they were saying. It's funny how, and I was going to pause at some point of this. At some point, if this conflict actually happened, you would get to the point where people kind of forget what it was originally about anyways. I think that would happen and does happen. I think often in civil wars and internal conflict, especially as they go on further and further, because the war becomes much more about survival than the ideology before it, as things become a lot more real. But I guess the biggest thing, I guess the disconnect, I guess I had there, if they were trying to be super serious about it, is how quickly this all devolved. Like, that was really quick. They were talking about within hours, basically. It's just like it become almost irreversible, and the arming and the militias and all this stuff happening. I feel like there would need to be a line of a whole bunch of these type of things happening, not just one decision, fake or not, which is another thing we could talk about just completely buying into it being real. You know what I mean? But yeah, the quick devolving of it. Yeah, I don't think necessarily. But anyways, I think there were some interesting things when they're talking about like states and which ones would, I guess, ally or not. They did, I think, presuppose some things about which states would react, where I think I was inserting, and I think and I still stand by this about who's giving these orders is largely going to determine which states have different decisions when it comes to allying, whether allying with other states or with the federal government in that way. I do think that does play a role. And there are going to be those people that may react, again, in a more revolutionary way, regardless of kind of who is in charge or, I guess, making these orders. Because I do think there are people that will put whatever values they have above all of that. But that group, I think, is maybe smaller than we think. But no, I could very much be wrong about that. All right, there are a bunch of other hypotheticals. If you were already typing stuff, it'd be interesting to see what you guys think. I'd love to hear you guys also insert any kind of historical references or precedent, context, whether it's in the United States history or other countries, that you think could play out in this analysis here. Because I don't think there was a lot of historical analysis or context or precedent brought up at all. So I tried to bring in some examples. Love to hear some more from you guys. And if you want me to cover more of this stuff, like, again, they have these other videos that are kind of similar from Infographics. Let me know. If you think it's dumb, we should move on to more serious things. That's understandable too. All right, we'll see y'all next time.